In 1947, when W.J. McKell was appointed as Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia on the advice of J.B. Chifley, R.G. Menzies was the federal leader of the opposition. Menzies criticised the appointment on the basis that the nominee was Australian, a politician, and had no military record. In 1965, Menzies recommended the appointment of Lord Casey as Governor-General. He was Australian and a retired politician, albeit one with a military record. McKell was the second Australian appointed to the office. The first, Sir Isaac Isaacs, had served from 1931. Casey was the first Australian to be nominated by a Conservative Prime Minister. In between McKell and Casey, 3 Britons served as Governor-General: Sir William Slynn, the first Viscount Dunrossell, and the first Viscount Delisle, on the nomination of Menzies. Since Casey, all nominations have been Australian. 2 serving politicians have been nominated, one by a Labor Prime Minister, the other by a Liberal Prime Minister, and not all have had a military record. Menzies has written about his approach to the nomination of a Governor-General and what he understood to be the role of the Sovereign in the appointment process. This paper will discuss the evolution of Menzies' approach to the nomination process and the way that the appointment of Casey did and did not set a precedent for future appointments to the office. And as you heard, I prepared this with Senator Smith, who has asked me to present the paper initially. So I'll give you a sense of what we've written, and then he'll offer some remarks that can lead into the question and answer afterwards. So the background to this is the development of the Office of the Governor-General, which really happened in 3 stages, and the appointment process develops in 3 stages accordingly. First, there's the colonial period, when the governor is basically a minor functionary of the colonial office, and as a result is appointed by the colonial office in the same way as any other ordinary government appointee of the British government. There's nothing special about it. There'd been some attempt to change the process, in particular with the rise of responsible government in the colonies. Colonial governments suggested that they should have some input into the appointment of the governor, given that the government was now accountable to Parliament in the same way as Westminster, but that was ignored by the colonial office. The first major change really happens with federation, when the new office of the Governor-General is seen to be the personal representative of the Sovereign. Initially, the Governor-General is both the personal representative of the Sovereign and the Agent General of the British government. The Governor-General is the channel for communications between the Australian government and the British government. And the Governor-General is originally appointed by the Sovereign on the advice of the British ministers of the Crown. And this is the way from the beginning of Federation. Hughes in 1919 suggested that this should be changed. He sent a proposal that said that Dominion governments should be able to nominate possible appointees. So the advice to appoint the Governor-General would still come from the British ministers, but at least the Australian ministers should be allowed to make suggestions about who they thought would be appropriate. This was rejected by the British, but as a concession, the British said that they would give a choice. So Hughes was given a choice of 3 candidates, and he chose Lord Forster. And from then on, we start to have this sort of understanding that maybe although it's still up to the British ministers to recommend the appointment to the King, they should allow some involvement from the Australian ministers. But the really important change happens in 1926 at the Imperial Conference, when it was agreed that the Governor-General was now to be the personal representative of the sovereign in right of the Dominion. And this is a fundamental change in the understanding of the structure of the British Empire and the beginning of the idea that, in fact, the crown is not one and indivisible anymore, but that there can be separate crowns in each of the dominions, and that the sovereign acts on the advice of the ministers in that dominion, not on the advice of the British ministers in relation to that dominion. So that's the basic important idea that happens, but part of what has to be dealt with in that is, well, who's going to make the recommendations to the king about who he should appoint as Governor-General, and what are the principles that are relevant for that. And that wasn't resolved in 1926 at the Imperial Conference. That was resolved at a following Imperial Conference in 1930, when it was agreed how this should be done. The background to this was that Scullin had been trying to get Sir Isaac Isaacs appointed as the first Australian Governor-General. The appointment occurred in 1931, but it formed the background to the Imperial Conference in 1930, because the British had word that this was the intention, and this was thought to be a radical innovation, that the king could be represented in Australia by an Australian. We now know from archival research that John Waugh undertook that George V was very active at this time in trying to influence the way the appointment would be made and the way the Imperial Conference of 1930 would be understood. And it's now clear that, that the King and Buckingham Palace thought that this was an opportunity to increase the role of the King in making the appointment of the Governor-General. Up until then, it had been made on the advice of the British ministers, and the King thought that this might be an opportunity for him to be able to make the decision personally, and he would decide who would represent him. That did not happen, and the British basically sided with Scullin and said, no, you have to accept that you're still going to act on advice, but you'll now act on the advice of the Australian ministers. And George V reluctantly accepted the advice to appoint Sir Isaac Isaacs. This was an innovation for a few reasons. He was Australian. He had served in politics, albeit a long time ago, because he'd been Chief Justice of the High Court at that time. And he was not someone personally known to the King. And up until then, it had been understood that the King would appoint someone to represent him who was known socially to the King and who could represent the King in the way that the King would wish to be represented. So Isaacs is appointed, and after his appointment, Lyons then reverts to the custom of British appointees. Lord Gowrie is appointed by George V, and then Curtin recommends the appointment of the King's brother, the Duke of Gloucester. So that takes us to the appointment in 1946 of McKell. And Chifley was the Prime Minister at the time, and Chifley decided he would revert to this idea of appointing an Australian, and he would recommend William McKell, who had been the Premier of New South Wales, who was still the serving Premier of New South Wales and who would step down and become Governor-General. This has been presented by historians as a decisive moment when McKell was committed to the idea that Australia needed to have an Australian Governor-General. That is now, we know, incorrect. It was not his first choice. And again, thanks to John Waugh, we know that he in fact wanted Louis Mountbatten, then the Viscount Mountbatten of Burma, subsequently Earl Mountbatten of Burma. That was his first choice, so a relation of the King. This was not immediately meant to be an Australian, but he decided that he would go with McKell, and then he dug in and he was determined. And again, we know that the king, by this time George VI, was not happy about this and tried to influence it behind the scenes, and War has published the correspondence about this, and in the end the king accepted that he had to act on advice, and he appointed McKell despite his concerns. Now, at this time, Menzies was the leader of the opposition, and he raised the matter 3 times in Parliament, in the House of Representatives. On the second occasion, or the first time, it was just a rumour and he didn't name the person. The second time, he said explicitly that he understood that the Labor Premier of New South Wales was being rumoured to be appointed. And then the third time was after it had been announced that it would be McKell, and he explains why he thinks this is a bad appointment. And he says, the Governor-General of Australia being the King's direct personal representative, the appointment of somebody notoriously not chosen either by or in effective consultation with him being the King, and whose appointment would, by reason of party political convictions, be distasteful to a large section of Australian citizens, must inevitably weaken the symbolism of the Governor-Generalship and therefore of the Crown which it represents. So he's objecting to the idea that an Australian politician will be appointed. He's careful, though, to say that his objection isn't merely that he's Australian, because Isaacs has already been appointed, so he knows he's lost that battle, and he knows that there's now a precedent for Australians. But he says the big problem here is that the appointee is someone who's been actively involved in Australian politics, and it's apparent that the King himself was concerned about this, and was concerned that someone who'd been directly involved in Australian politics wouldn't be impartial in the way that the sovereign's representative should be. And he says in the House of Representatives, the notion that a Governor-General or a Governor is the direct personal representative of the King would obviously be falsified. The prestige of the office, which depends upon subtle and intangible matters, including a deep emotional response in the hearts of the citizens, would inevitably decline. And we see Menzies arguing in 2 ways here. He talks about the sorts of personal qualities that are important, and he talks about the importance of the imperial link. He says, an intelligent understanding of the importance of the Crown as the symbol of empire unity requires that the nominee or nominees of ministers should be able, by reason of character, attainments, temperament, and experience, to act in Australia with that detachment, impartiality in great constitutional issues, and dignity which inhere in the Crown in the government of the United Kingdom. And I think to the modern reader, his discussion of personal qualities resonates and seems like something we would still think is very relevant. His preoccupation with imperial unity just seems to us now like something from another world, and doesn't seem remotely like a relevant consideration. So that's the second time he talks about it in Parliament. The third time he talks about it is in the context of a motion of want of confidence in the government. He levels a number of charges against the government, including that they have constantly practiced political jobbery in public appointments. And he says the worst example of this is the appointment of McKell as Governor-General. And he says it's a mistake to appoint someone who's been directly involved in Australian politics, but worse than that, he says, McKell participated in a caucus vote on his successor after it had been announced that he was going to be the Governor-General. And he says, at least McKell could have avoided the worst of this if he would have immediately withdrawn from any political activity. And he says, this shows that he still regards himself as a Labor man, and he's not demonstrating the sort of impartiality that's required by the office. Chifley responded to Menzies, and he said, Mr. McKell will bring to the position a ripe experience of affairs and a knowledge of administration in Australia. He will bring with him also a full appreciation of the aspirations and ideals of the Australian people. I think this last sentence is really important. The idea that that he will be a good Governor-General because he will bring a full appreciation of the aspirations and ideals of the Australian people. And I think when Senator Smith offers his remarks, he might say something about the way that has continued to be something that has been seen as being important in recommending a nomination for the Governor-General. John Ewer, in an article about this, notes that after McKell's time, when it fell to Menzies to appoint someone, he says, Menzies seized on the opportunity to appoint a person with more obvious support for the political order held dear by Menzies and his party. A person who exemplified all the qualities of the liberal version of non-partisanship so valued in the Menzies era. And I think this contrast between the Chifley position and the Menzies position is relevant because this is still a tension, I think, in how Prime Ministers have recommended appointments as Governor-General. And it goes to something I think that Ewer identifies, that there are, as early as the time of Chifley and Menzies, competing ideas of non-partisanship. What does it mean to be non-partisan or impartial? And it's clear that there are two different ideas going on, and everybody agrees that the Governor-General should be non-partisan or impartial, but from Chifley onwards, the Labor idea of what that means seems to be more connected with something like a full appreciation of the aspirations and ideals of Australian people, and the Menzies idea has something much more to do with detachment, and so we see this, I think, go on. So Menzies then has his opportunity to appoint a Governor-General, or rather to recommend the appointment. He has the opportunity on 4 occasions, and we know something about his approach from the account he gives in his memoirs, Afternoon Light. And he talks about the first time he had to recommend an appointment in 1952 when he was in London on other business, and he raised the matter with the Queen. And I think it's probably well known to people, the famous account he gives here. He says to the Queen, well, it's not for me to tell you who you have to appoint. We need to discuss the possibilities. And he says, so what we'll do is you'll write down 3 names in order of preference. I'll write down 3 names in order of preference. And I happen to be going to see the Marquess of Salisbury at the weekend, so we'll ask him to write down 3 names as well, and then we'll compare them. And the story goes that when they opened the 3 envelopes, each of them had as their first preference Slim, and that's how we end up with the recommendation of Slim as the next Governor-General. And Menzies is clear that he says this happens in 2 parts. There's to be informal consultation, which was the comparing of the lists, and then after that he would offer his formal advice. The Queen could participate actively in the first part, the informal consultation, but when it came to the formal advice, she would act on the advice of the Prime Minister, and that's all there was to it. And he gives a rather florid account of this in Afternoon Light, which I think some scholars have perhaps misrepresented or misunderstood the tone of what was going on there, which perhaps has something more to do with his idea of courtly behaviour and the way that it was appropriate to speak to the Queen. Anyhow, he also tells us that what his view of the 1930 resolution of the Imperial Conference was. He rejects Scullin's approach, and he's very clear. He says the only change that happened was that we had a move from the British ministers making recommendations to the Australian ministers making recommendations. He says it was always the case that we needed to keep this. We had to have an informal consultation, but the time for that would remain. And Scullin rejected that and said, no, I just tell you and that's it. So how much of this survives now? How much of Menzies' approach is still with us? To some extent, the principles that Menzies tells us are still there. It's still the case that the sovereign acts on the advice of the Prime Minister. It's no longer the case that there's this informal discussion. It's quite clear from the statement Scott Morrison gave that that's not the case. It's still the case, I think, that impartiality matters, although, as I flagged, it's still a disagreement about what impartiality means, and it's clearly no longer the case that it's thought to be important that there should be a personal understanding, a personal knowledge on the sovereign's part before the person's appointed. I've been told I've run out of time, so I'll stop, and the Senator can maybe say something, and then we can have some questions.
Well, thank you very much to Damien for that. Just by context, I thought I would share with you that I'm an avowed constitutional monarchist. But what interests me is how constitutional monarchy in Australia has some defining characteristics that are not shared with other similar nations like Canada and New Zealand. And what I was particularly interested in with this exercise is how the evolution of thinking around constitutional monarchy and the appointment process in particular has sustained it rather than eroded it. And I think that's for me, that's a really important point when understanding Menzies' contribution to institutions that I would regard as central to our democratic success. And my attention to this was enlivened, particularly the conversation around what impartiality might mean for the interpretation of impartiality for a Labor appointment compared to impartiality for a Liberal appointment. And of course, most recently, we had the decision to appoint Samantha Mostyn. And what struck me as being consistent with the Labor interpretation of impartiality were the words that the Prime Minister used, echoing Chifley's comments about full appreciation of the aspiration and identity of the Australian people. When he described Samantha Mostyn, he talked about Samantha Mostyn as being an exceptional leader who represents the best of modern Australia. He characterised her as a modern and optimistic leader. But what struck me as more significant was listening to Samantha Mostyn's contributions in the Senate when she was sworn in as Governor-General. And I don't have an answer or an explanation for this, just an observation. Much of her effort in her contribution, both in the Senate chamber being formally sworn in, but also at the reception that happened just outside the Senate chamber, was her great emphasis to highlight her connection to military. Drew attention to her father's 40-year service as an officer in the military and his Vietnam service. Drew attention to the fact that her sister had married into the Australian Army. Recounted the story of the history of the 21-gun salute and its association with the emptying of the guns when ships would enter ports. So much so that she recognised the Federation Guard prior to the Welcome to Country contribution that she... And this struck me as very curious, because there can be no doubt about Samantha Mostyn fulfilling that Chifley, now Prime Minister Albanese, view about representing aspirationally a certain vision for our country, but the great personal effort that she went to in drawing an association and a connection with the military. And I thought that was powerful, though I don't have an explanation for it. But going back to Menzies, and in Afternoon Light we read this particularly, that he was not opposed to change. He recognised that change would be inevitable. And so for myself, when I look at issues like this, but also other discussions around Menzies' legacy, it's the evolution of his positions that I think sustains, for me, an understanding and appreciation, a durability of his ideas, not that they were fixed. And so working with Damien on this particular project, I was sort of greatly reassured that my thinking about Menzies was, enlivened and emboldened by understanding this particular topic as well. So I thought I would just share those remarks, not to give you any answers necessarily, but to highlight to you, why I've enjoyed working with Damien on this, and why I've got every confidence that constitutional monarchy will evolve, but will be a mainstay of our democratic features for many, many years to come. Thank you.
David?
Thanks very much for a really enjoyable paper. My question is about the war power. Does Menzies say anything about the Curtin government's change of the war power in 1941-42, where instead of that being a decision based on British advice of British ministers, it was one based on Australian ministers' advice?
I think I have to say this is something a bit beyond the scope of the paper, unless there's... George, you don't have a... No, I don't think I could comment on that without looking it up, I'm sorry. That's my one question.
Charles, yeah.
If no one else is keen, I will take it. Thank you, it was really, really interesting. On the 3 occasions where a serving politician's been appointed as Governor-General, so William McKell, Paul Hasluck and later Bill Hayden, each time there's been that criticism that they can't be impartial, they're a politician, they're committed to one side. With hindsight, each of them, I think there's general agreement, was shown to have discharged their duties with wonderful impartiality and won respect from all sides. But there's no guarantee of that. I mean, there's nothing in the system to stop a Prime Minister appointing someone who really is just a party hack and will do whatever the party says. What can we do about that, or what in the system as you see it now protects us against that?
Well, I'd make, in response to that, I would make this observation that prior to the appointment of Samantha Mostyn, it was actually parliamentarians that were being considered, in the public discourse, the assumption was that it was parliamentarians that were being considered for the role. And someone who, watches these things closely and perhaps might have drawn up my own prospective list of who I thought Anthony Albanese might have appointed, Samantha Mostyn was not on the list, but in hindsight seems so obvious as a Anthony Albanese appointment. So specifically, I suspect, and it is just pure suspicion, I suspect that given the broader political context, it would have been, if it was being considered, I think the decision would have been made very, very quickly that that was an unwise move, given the fractured nature of the partisan contest at that particular point in time, if it was at all being contemplated. Yeah.
Just quickly, Frank, and then we'll have to, sorry, Judy.
Thank you. Frank Bongiorno, ANU. Would it be fair to say that, yes, the monarchy's evolved, the constitutional monarchy's evolved? Would you agree it's become less embedded and less significant in the kind of, I guess Australian life, including civic and political life? Because, I mean, that's another way of sort of looking at the story that you told. A place for the monarch in, as late as the selection of Slim, at least with Menzies going through the motions of that, to a point now where the monarch clearly has really basically acts on the advice of the government of the day. And, I wonder if that's a part of a larger story of kind of an evolution that is also a kind of the monarchy becoming less of a presence, I guess, in everyday civic life.
I'd have a different observation, but along similar lines. My observation is that the Crown in Australia has distinctly Australian characteristics, and those characteristics are an understatedness. Those characteristics are perhaps an invisibility. And by that I don't mean a laziness or a complacency, not at all, but that the Crown is how it has evolved and how it operates in our country has largely always been thus. Put aside images of royal tours and those sorts of things in 1954, etc. Compare that to New Zealand, where its historical arrangements are significantly different, and in Canada, which perhaps has a more royalist tone to how the Crown operates in its constitution. So I'd argue, rather than it having changed, that it has always been thus understated, invisible, but highly relevant to our democratic success.